Barbados has not had a history of giving a one-term government, far less a government after 3 years.
These mistakes really put into question her political longevity at this point in time.
I rather suspect that the personality factor must have been a huge one in terms of how people voted in this election.
It's the evening after the Barbados election. Mayor Amor Mottley leading the Barbados Labour Party to a consecutive election sweep. It's only the second time this is happening in the CARICOM region, with Grenada's new national party, the other organization to record such a feat. But what is the significance of Mottley's election sweep? Hello, I'm Damion Mitchell, and thank you for joining us for this special discussion analyzing the 2022 Barbados election. Joining us are Special Assignment Editor at the RJR Gleaner Group, Earl Moxham, Editor-in-Chief at the Gleaner, Kamar Jordan. She has lived and worked in Barbados as a journalist for many years and is a Barbadian, really. And we also do have Colville Monsey, a journalist at the Nation newspaper. Well, it's the first time I'm getting the chance at once to speak to my former boss and my current boss. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's begin with you then, Colville. What's the significance of this 30 love for a second time for Mayor Mottley?
Well, in terms of the significance, there are many questions that one now has to try to analyze going forward. For example, what does this now mean for an opposition with Barbados two-party system? One party has always been present. The last time prior to 2018 that we had such low opposition presence, I think when they would have referred to that as the two blind mice. That would have been Kelman and former Prime Minister David Thompson. Many thought that there would have been some resurgence after the 2018 30-0 defeat. The party had a new leadership under, that's the DLP, under Ms. Vola de Pisa, and some young candidates. And many were hoping that the stain of the Frondell Stewart administration would have left the party and the party would have had some resurgence and there could at least been some presence in the lower house. Now, the two seats that many were watching would have been St. Philip West and St. Philip North. Now, the fact that none of these materialized is also of significance. The fact that St. John as well, which has been a Democratic Labour Party stronghold for the last 60 years, has not returned home either, speaks volumes as to what exactly is the state of the Democratic Labour Party base at this point. And again, these are all questions that that has to be answered in the long run. What is the state of the two-party state in Barbados at this point?
Kamar Jordan, you pay close attention to the politics in Barbados. Mayor Mottley had said that she was calling the election way ahead of the constitutional deadline because she wanted a unified country going forward. Does this in any way settle that concern?
It doesn't really settle that because the political system is in itself divisive. And we've seen over the last 3 years, even though we had essentially one party in parliament, still the voices of the opposition were being heard through social media on the grounds in terms of a recent nurses protest, etc. So I don't think it is realistic of Ms. Mottley to say she wants a united party. I think what this election really was about was that there was one force, particularly in terms of the opposition, that was pulling people onto the streets, etc. And Ms. Mottley wanted to retain her one seat that went over to the opposition when Reverend Joseph Adderley, after the last election, chose to go over to the opposition benches in the interest of democracy was his reason given. And as a result of that, I think at the time Ms. Mottley wasn't too bothered by that, but we've seen in recent weeks and recent months that the noises from the opposition have become louder, and there's been some traction, particularly from one Caswell Franklin, who is the opposition senator in the upper house. He's also a trade union leader, and he's been using that trade union support to get nurses out there to agitate against the government to say, look, we need to get a pay increase right now at this time, while the Prime Minister has been giving the nurses kudos for their management of the situation with the COVID. Government has said that it can't start to pick groups to give salary increases to because that could run it into a dangerous form of territory. So this was an uncomfortable position in recent months. We also had a situation where the announcement of the Republic was generally seen as a good thing for Barbados, getting rid of the Queen finally as our head of state. But the problem with it was that in the Barbados Labour Party's 2018 manifesto, it had promised that that process would be the subject of a referendum. That never took place. So therefore, these issues also were creating some grumbles and some disquiet within the populace. And I think Ms. Mottley wanted to quell those issues once and for all. We also heard one third thing, Damion, which is that there were rumblings within our own cabinet. Some people were not satisfied that they were getting the support that they wanted for one reason or the other, and that was creating some issues as well. So I don't think we're going to see unity in its true sense, but certainly Ms. Mottley has now reclaimed that one seat, which was the one thing achieved here with this election result. And therefore she can continue on in terms of the process that would have been started over the last 3 years.
Which brings us to the question then, Earl Moxham, can there be effective governance without an opposition in the historical context of a place like Barbados?
Well, I think it calls now on other groups in the society. Civil society needs to be energized. The vanquished Democratic Labour Party needs also to be energized and engaged. The fact that you have not succeeded in securing seats in the parliament once again, it might be disappointing, but it does not mean that you do not have a voice, and it does not mean that you do not have a certain percentage of the populace with you. So I think the Democratic Labour Party now needs to get its act together. This is no time for it to sink into despair. It may be a time for some introspection and to look at the question of how to reorganize, look at their leadership, etc., but also to draw strength from their history. And if they do that, then I think that coming out of this, you could see a better outcome, not just for the Dems, but for the society in general. Bear in mind as well that I believe the voter turnout was something in the order of 40%.
40%.
So that, as with the last election in Jamaica, where the outturn was something in the region of 39%. This does not reflect necessarily an overwhelming mandate in terms of the overall view of the populace of the country. It means that one party has been better able to get out its votes and to secure the seats in parliament, but it does not necessarily mean that it speaks for all Barbados in this instance.
And let me pick up on that point, because this is one of the issues, that of voter apathy. Are you sensing, Colville, that there is a huge level of apathy among the populace in Barbados as reflected by the outturn?
I cannot put it down solely to voter apathy. There were issues with COVID. That was one factor. And also, even on the day of polling itself, you had persons turned away because of the length of time that it was taken to actually vote. To say that voter apathy is rising in Barbados is, I get a bit premature at this point.
May I make a particular point?
Sure.
And it has to do with the question of ideology versus personality. The two dominant political parties in Barbados, the Barbados Labour Party and the Democratic Labour Party, are rooted in a history of being very close ideologically. I think they are described as being slightly center of left, or left of center rather. And therefore, it really has been, certainly in more recent times, if you look at it, personalities count. And the personality of Mayor Mottley has been very, very significant and very impactful. In fact, she has taken the globe by storm, some would say. If you look at David Thompson when he became leader of the Dems and Prime Minister briefly, you make a comparison between him and his successor, Prudell Stewart, and you see that it was like night and day between the two persons. So if there is no significant difference in terms of ideology and policy priorities, then it comes down to personalities. Now, I'm not in Barbados and I'm not following the politics and policy implementation program very closely there, but I rather suspect that the personality factor must have been a huge one in terms of how people voted in this election. And therefore, the Dems will have to look closely at that factor in terms of who do they choose going forward.
I want to come back to the issue of voter apathy, but just before that, let me ask you the question, Earl, since you are on the floor. Does this decisive win now anchor Mia Mottley as really the star of CARICOM?
I believe so, but I think in order for her to continue to be the star of CARICOM, so to speak, she has to bear in mind that, you know, in terms, if you want to go biblical, it doesn't take long between the proclamation, it doesn't take long between Palm Sunday and the crucifixion. And so she has to bear that in mind. Coming back to our own situation in Jamaica, in 1976, Michael Manley seen, or between 72 and 76, he could do no wrong. He won the 1976 election, albeit under the cloud of a state of emergency, but he won it easily. And by 1980, he was out, despised, rejected by middle-class Jamaica, by so much of Upper St. Andrew and a broad cross-section of the society. And therefore, you can take nothing for granted. And yes, at this moment, she is the most attractive leader, not just in Barbados, but across CARICOM. And it's important to have a leader with that kind of global stature, because we have been lacking that for a while. But at the same time, I'm saying one has to be careful and not get too carried away.
Very well.
I would like to pick up on Paul's point. Yes, I agree that ideologically, both parties are pretty much similar. They are pretty much branches of the same tree. But at the same time, going back to the question of voter apathy, as I said, this election would not be an adequate litmus test for that, given the fact that we had these other mitigating factors, such as COVID, such as the pandemic, such as other issues that related to the length of time that it was taken to vote, given the protocols, etc. These are all issues that have to be factored in at this point before we can determine that, yes, we had some level of voter apathy. So again, this election would not be an accurate litmus test.
Well,
I want to bring it in on the discussion, because I also want to ask you whether you think that the voting choice of the Barbadian population is largely on mature issues.
To be honest, and I really wanted to join it onto what Colville was saying there, because I disagree with him slightly. We've seen a trend. If we go back in terms of voter turnout from 2008, and I can even go further back, we've been seeing constantly, every time there's an election, there's a smaller turnout. So we went 63% in 2008, 62% in 2013, 60% in 2018, and now we have 40%. And as Colville said, though, we can't leave out the issues in terms of COVID and all that's going on. But there's another factor, Damion, that we haven't discussed yet. If you look at the history of elections in Barbados, and I take Earl's point too about personality, but we've always had big personalities. Owen Arthur was a huge personality. Errol Barrow was a huge personality. So we've always had personality politics factoring in. One of the issues, though, is that Barbados has not had a history of giving a one-term government, far less a government after 3 years. This government just basically came to office, and it came to office on the heels of a sewage problem along our south coast in Barbados. It came on the heels of a lot of other problems in terms of water across the rural communities of Barbados, etc. So real human issues that really made people fed up and tired with the Friend Stewart administration and wanting to see the back of it. Ms. Mottley has come in, and COVID has come on top of that. She started to address those. She bought the trucks for garbage collection when garbage was piling up on the streets. She dealt with the sewage right away. And even though I mentioned earlier the nurses' protest, and I mentioned there were some issues with people saying she was emphasizing family and friends, and people talking about the fact that there was no referendum, really and truly, there weren't these hardcore issues after 3 years that really meant that they just need to go out there and get her out. It wasn't that at all. So I really think that that has to be factored in, that it was only 3 years ago that the last administration that had an awful and abysmal record in terms of the problems affecting social issues affecting the population left the scene. So then for Ms. DePisa to come in, and this is where I am a little sympathetic to Ms. DePisa, and to some extent the Democratic Labour Party team that was presented just before us, and I don't agree with Earl too. I don't think this is the end of them, but it means that they have to do some serious introspection, because really and truly, looking at how Ms. Mottley has been performing on the world stage, how can Barbadians go out in their numbers and vote to take her out on the basis that there wasn't so much of a major problem with her performance, you know?
Which brings me to the question, is it that the Barbadian population is mature, a mature voting audience? In other words, voting on the basis of issues and not so much on political partisan matters?
I certainly did not expect them to vote the Barbados Labour Party and Mia Mottley out of office after 3 years. I certainly did not expect that, Kmar. What many people were looking at was whether the Dems would have been able to claw back a few seats.
Yes.
I think that is what caught many by surprise, that even with only a 3-year interregnum, and given the fact that there are some seats that they were traditionally strong in, you might have thought that they would have done their homework and that they would have done well enough to pull back a few of those seats from the Barbados Labour Party. Not for one moment did I think that Mottley was going to lose this election.
Yes.
As far as the leadership of the Dems are concerned, far be it from me to suggest from this distance that they need to throw out their current leaders, but they certainly need to re-examine what went wrong, and if indeed the current leadership stands or stays, then what can be done to improve their performance? Because the magic of Mia Mottley's personality, never mind what I said about how things can change rapidly depending on the circumstances, that you cannot rely on that magic disappearing overnight. You really have to do the hard work in order to compete. And that's the point I'm making, that they will have to work very hard at that. And to the extent that they might be able to attract additional talent, then they need to work on that as well.
Which brings this question in though, Earl, in respect of the future of DePisa. Let me hear from you, Colville, on this matter. Is she speaking too early when she says that she intends to stay on as the leader of the Dems?
I'm not sure that she said that she intends to stay on as the leader of the Dems. I think she said that this is a matter that has to now be weighed internally within the party, and a decision has to be made. But one has to take into account, when considering the future of Ms. DePisa, the fact that this is her third, I think, outing in elective politics, and a third straight loss. And that does not augur well for someone who is aspiring to lead one of the cornerstones of Barbados's political system. Now, the issue is that from the very onset, in terms of even before this campaign would have started, her choice of where to run, because again, St. John would have been the cornerstone, one of the main pillars of that party, that mainly leaders of the party would come from. You had, Barrow running there, David Thompson running there, and basically it would have been a seat that you would have wanted to solidify and bring back home, and no less than a leader should have undertaken that responsibility. However, she chose to go to St. Lucie instead, for reasons that are known and have clearly backfired at this point. And these mistakes really put into question her political longevity at this point in time. And having especially come up again under 3 challenges, I think, since in 3 years of being in office.
Yes, we're fast running out of time, and I know Kmar has an intervention that she wants to make. But to be fair to DePisa, she essentially had said that she has no immediate plans to step down.
Some people will say that this is a deciding vote, if you will, on your leadership of the party. What say you?
Well, as I said, we will make those decisions at some future stage. I do believe that, for me personally, the rest can speak for themselves, I am proud of what I have accomplished along with them for the Democratic Labour Party, and we will make those determinations sometime in the future, but not tonight.
Over to you, Kemar.
Not to be unkind to Verla de Pisa, but she's really been a political placeholder. And I think we really need to see the Democratic Labour Party get back to the stage that you have a leader that has that kind of charisma and national persona and personality, and even international, because that is what the Barbadian electorate has become accustomed to. I spoke earlier about Owen Seymour Arthur. He was one that before Miss Mottley came around was, blazing a trail on the international stage. Errol Walton Barrow, similarly, when we go back in terms of the history of Barbados. And Verla has a far way to go, starting with winning a parliamentary seat. She's never been able to do that. So it does not engender that level of confidence and support. So I agree with Earl that there are lots of issues that need to be worked out in terms of this party getting itself in shape and getting itself ready to be a force to be reckoned with in terms of Barbados, because Ms. Mottley said it last night when she won. She talked about her strategy team. She spoke about her genius in Hartley Henry, who's her strategist. And she made the point that winning an election is not just about turning up on the day. It is about a whole set of work that goes into there. And I think that has been lacking from the DLP. They've been around. They have a strategist now who worked with Ms. Mottley incidentally, but they have not grasped, I think, the full elements that need to be brought together to produce a winning result for them.
Moving on to you, Earl, to say final 30 seconds, your immediate expectations of the Mia Mottley administration.
I would expect that it will be consolidating its position in terms of policy issues in Barbados and will continue to push for some of the global issues that she has been pursuing. I just wanted to make a quick point that it's interesting that in her early years, it seems that she took inspiration not so much from the dominant leader of the BLP in her growing up years, who was Tom Adams. She was inspired by Errol Barrow of the Democratic Labour Party. So maybe there's a lesson in that for some of those in the BLP right now.
Colville, your immediate expectations of the administration in 30 seconds?
Immediately after winning, yes, as outlined in the Prime Minister's manifesto, there are some issues, as she would have alluded to, that are quite tough that she would be implemented. Some of those are international in nature in terms of taking Barbados forward in climate change, resilience, and so on. And others are domestic in terms of shoring up the state security, social security net, other, like maybe through immigration and other issues along that line. And then there is the looming question as to what is going to be the situation in terms of, is there going to be a continuation with the IMF program, which basically was stymied as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and so on. So those are the things that I would expect.
Very well. Kemar, Jordan, what are you expecting?
I would say the economy, COVID, and cabinet. I would say from the economic standpoint, we've seen heavy borrowing by this administration. Barbados boasts now of some $2 billion in international reserves, but this is borrowing. Somebody has to pay going down the road. And what we need from the Mottley administration are really strong, clear reforms in terms of making this a real economy with real performance and not beefing it up with these artificial indicators. So that's one for me. I would say also too, in terms of COVID, we saw all sorts of things during the election campaign. Now we are back to some level of sanity. How are we going to bring those numbers back down that we've seen rising in recent weeks? And the other thing also is the cabinet, this bloated cabinet, 26 members for 166 square mile country. Ms. Mottley needs to do something about that. And we're expecting with her announcement next week, she's going to deal with that and name a health minister, because she lost Lieutenant Colonel Bostic, who was one of her top performers in the cabinet, has just retired, who is going to take over this all-important health portfolio in the midst of all the changes, Damion.
Well, thank you so very much. Good note on which to end that, looking forward to the administration of Mia Mottley in Barbados. This has been a special discussion. Thanks also to assignment editor at the RJR Gleaner Group, Earl Moxham, the editor-in-chief at the Gleaner, Kemar Jordan, and also to Colville Munzi, journalist at the Nation newspaper. I'm Damion Mitchell. Thanks for watching.